to get along. And I stimulated that in every way, and I believe that that's very important, particularly when leaders such as the heads of the Soviet Union and the United States at that time meet, because until the Geneva summit for 6 years there hadn't been summits between the Soviet and American leaders at a time when the situation was very tense. So my final view of President Reagan is that he was a great president. He was a person who represented the right wing of the Republican Party and who was able to go beyond many stereotypes. And despite all the criticism from some members of his own team, from some people who are present here today, he still made reciprocal steps, working with Gorbachev, working with the Soviet Union. I would like to thank George Shultz for his great contribution in making our relations a constructive, open, and mutually respectful relationship. We learned to listen to each other, and to put questions and discuss questions, and we ultimately built a situation that produced the decisions that we took.
I had the privilege of being at the Geneva meeting, and I watched it unfold. And as I think back on it, I saw the relationship between Presidents Gorbachev and Reagan evolve. It went on for 2 days. First thing that happened was a private meeting. And it was scheduled to go on, I think, for 10 minutes. It went on for about an hour and a half. And a lot of people were nervous, break it up, get on the schedule. I said, well, no, don't break it up. This is what it's for. So they came out of the meeting. Well, okay, I don't know. You said how you were praised. But then we had a plenary session. And in the afternoon, during a break, all of a sudden, President Gorbachev and President Reagan took a walk. They went down to some cabin on Lake Geneva where there was a fire and a fireplace, and you sat down there. I wasn't there, but I know when you came back, there were two friends almost talking about what was going to happen. Then we went to the next day.
From that fireside house,
yes.
President Reagan suddenly said to me, what would you do if the United States were attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us? I said, no doubt about it. He said, we too. So that's interesting. I'm sorry for having interrupted you, but it was an interesting moment.
It was, but I'm so happy you did. So, yes?
Wait a minute. So then the next morning, first day went well, then you gave a dinner for us. And there were about, I don't know, 10 or 12 people there. And it was kind of fun. And Raisa was there, Nancy Reagan was there, and so there was a little bit of feminine presence, which always helps. Then the next morning, so things seemed to be going well. The next morning, I think President Reagan, as he always did in her private meeting, put a lot of emphasis on human rights, Soviet Jewry, and so on, as I read the transcript. And you both came out, and there was a little tension. But I said to myself, one of the things that has emerged from this is that President Gorbachev, who I had met with several times before this, sees how important this subject is to President Reagan. Then we had a little explosion about strategic defense, which was always a big topic. But by the time the day was over, we had good conversation going. And then the dinner that night was a warm event. And then when you had your press conference in Geneva the next morning, you and President Reagan spoke in a constructive way, publicly. So I saw an evolution during that 2 days. And I remember our delegation went immediately from Geneva to Brussels, and President Reagan reported to our NATO ally heads of government, and there was a sense of relief. Then he came back to the United States and addressed a joint session of Congress. And there was a sense of relief that these two leaders somehow can have a conversation. And I thought it was a big, important event.
And I went from there to Prague, where the heads of the Warsaw Pact were present, and I told them about our first meeting. And there was full understanding and support, which means that by that time there was a general understanding that something needed to be done. Something needed to be done in order to relieve the tensions that could lead to a greatly dangerous conflict, that there is a need to do something against the nuclear arms race, to stop that nuclear arms race. So we were acting with due account for the signals that we were getting from the people in our countries and in other countries.
Give us a sense of where you and the president were coming from, and in terms of what you thought you could achieve, and what had motivated both of you to believe you could accomplish something on the idea of Soviet Jews being able to come out of the Soviet Union and immigrate to Israel, to the United States, and other places.
Charlie, you have to start with the idea of freedom. That the world works better if people have freedom. Then when you see people who want to emigrate and can't, their freedom has been curtailed. When you see that they want to worship their way and they have difficulty, their freedom has been curtailed. I might say early in the Reagan administration, we had a practically unknown negotiation that got a group of Pentecostals who had rushed into our embassy. We negotiated out, and they all were allowed to leave along with their families. And the deal was, we'll let them out if you don't crow. And President Reagan never crowed. But it gave us the sense, something can happen. So you keep after it, but let me just make a point about the Soviet Jewry effort. Somebody earlier mentioned the Seder that I went to in Moscow. And there's a tendency to think you go to something like that, and the idea is you're going to buck these people up. They're repressed, they can't leave. And you're there to let them know that people care, people know about it. But you hardly set foot and start talking to them, then the inspiration is all the other way. And you say, my goodness, here are these human beings, and they stand up for what they believe in, no matter what. And that's got to inspire you and say that if you can help to bring this about, it's really important in human terms. So that's a lot of the motivation, I think.
You and the president talked about it in terms of freedom and...
We talked about it a lot, and of course I talked with Ken Bialkin and a lot of other people about it. It was a preoccupation of the Reagan administration.
And President Gorbachev, how would the president bring it up with you, in conversations with you, the idea of Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union?
He mentioned it at every meeting.
At every meeting.
На каждой встрече.
На каждой встрече.
At every
Более
meeting,
того,
indeed.
как только мы садились уже
And
в последующем за
when
переговорный стол,
we then went to the negotiating table,
я говорю, у вас есть конверт с
I
просьбами?
said, Mr. President, I know that you have a list of your requests for the consideration of specific cases. Give me that list. I will instruct my people to consider it very seriously.
То есть процесс он двигался.
So it was an evolving process, but the important thing was to address the question of principle, and that was related to the overall process of freedom, of free elections, and that included also free immigration, freedom of worship, freedom. That new atmosphere, that new situation changed things, and then specific decisions were taken.
Поэтому это
So,
трудно давалось.
of course, was a difficult process. In our country, there were some people who were saying, well, let them go, let all of them go if they don't like it here. And I said that this would be a scandal, this kind of an expulsion would have been certainly a terrible signal to the people about what was happening in the Soviet Union. So we needed to adopt laws on freedom and democracy, and that concerned all people, all our citizens, including Jews. Since among the Jews there were many people wanting to go, they were the first to benefit from the new law on immigration.
Did the Jackson-Vanik bill have an impact?
Ну нет, нет.
No.
Нет.
Why
Она,
do-
кстати, и сейчас
By the way, that
существует.
law still is in effect.
Как этому можно
Why?
оставить?
Why is that? Why was that left? Why did we leave it?
I think something like Jackson Vanik, with all due respect, and certainly Scoop was a great man, I think in a way it has a negative impact, because it says to our friends in the Soviet Union, we're forcing you to do this. And that doesn't work. It's got to be something they decide they want to do because it's in their interests. And I'd like to ask President Gorbachev a question in that regard. You and I talked kind of on the side sometimes about the information age and how it was affecting the world, and how it meant that when you had a society that was very compartmented and closed, you were going to lose out. So in order to be part of this information age, opening up more was in your interests. And I've often wondered if that, as I know you thought about that and you responded to that, if that line of argument didn't have an impact on your attitude toward
Мы
immigration.
вообще, да, но прежде всего
Yes,
внутренний
indeed,
процесс
but it was above all the internal processes underway in the Soviet Union that impacted our decision, because we saw that
Новые меры встречают, перестроечные меры,
the
встречают сопротивление.
decisions that we took as part of perestroika were being resisted by the bureaucracy, by certain people. I will not list them. And so the only way to succeed was
Дать свободу.
to give
Слово.
people freedom of the press, freedom to speak, to give people glasnost, so that people learn their history, so that they learn the current problems. And the entire nation, all the Soviet Union, started to speak out in more than 100 languages. And it was, of course, a shock. It was a kind of release from something. People began to speak out without fear. They started to raise issues. They started to rally. They started to demand.
Вот это было очень
This
важно.
was very important.
И информация стала другой.
And the information, there was a different kind of information.
Интернета
Of course, even in the internet age, information is something that you must address in a special way, because the problem is that the fourth estate, the press, the media, is very strong, and it's very important for the media to be professional, to be principled, to be honest, not to serve particular clannish interests, not to be bought. And that is an issue still, in my opinion.
I want to come back to Soviet Jewry, but I want to go to other issues that were part of the relationship. Arms control.
Could I conclude our discussion of Reagan? I would like to say that 2 years ago, George Shultz visited Russia, and let me tell you a secret. Perhaps I shouldn't be doing it, but anyway, I think it's okay. I asked George, at that time, other than Reagan, was there anyone else who could really reciprocate despite all of the stereotypes, despite all of the things that had accumulated, all the bad things, and to move toward us, to reciprocate? He said, practically, without missing a beat, no one else other than Reagan. So that is what Reagan meant. And I always add that if there hadn't been George Shultz with President Reagan, then President Reagan perhaps wouldn't have become what he did become. And Nancy, too, should be remembered. So the hawk evolved into a peacemaker.
Let me take that feeling and take it to Reykjavik, where plays have been written about this. The idea that these two leaders came very close to signing, or at least to agreeing, on the most dramatic nuclear disarmament that history would ever have seen.
Yes, it was an extraordinary meeting. And they agreed that we should try to work for a world free of nuclear weapons. Basically agreed to end the intermediate range nuclear forces, so-called INF missiles, agreed to cut strategic weapons in half. And while in the end it broke up without formalizing anything, once these matters get out there on the table, they're out there. And it took a little time to consolidate, but it did. And if you look at a chart at the number of nuclear weapons in the world, it sort of peaks around Reykjavik, and it's come down a great deal. It's come down because the arsenals of the United States and Russia have come down. But that's a deceptive number because they have been going up with other countries. Other countries have been acquiring nuclear weapons. And the threat of them falling into hands that you don't like is growing. But Reykjavik was dramatic. The idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons was not popular, at least when we came home. And our mutual friend Margaret Thatcher came and, you know, there's a verb in the British language. You know, remember she carried that hard handbag? You can get handbagged, and I got handbagged. But maybe now the reaction is different. Maybe this is an idea whose time has come.
Ну, почему вы не хотите сказать, что она сказала, еще один Reykjavik?
Don't you want to actually quote her? She said, one more Reykjavik, I will not survive.
All right. Do you believe that we can look back at Reykjavik and say that was an idea whose time has come in this year, and there are possibilities because of the fear of proliferation to achieve something remarkable?
Да, да.
Yes.
Yes.
God.
Da. All right.
Yes.
you saw President Obama. What was the conversation about?
У нас была короткая беседа.
With President Obama, I had a short conversation.
Я еще раз его поздравил.
I congratulated him once again.
Он на мою поздравительную телеграмму.
He replied to my letter of congratulations that I sent to him after the election with a very substantive letter, not just a formal thank you note. It was the first acquaintance. I heard from the president
Желание улучшить
that
отношения.
he wanted improved relations with Russia.
Вот я этим ограничусь.
And let me confine myself to this. Let me also say that I had a detailed 1-hour conversation with the Vice President, and in summing up, I would say that the conclusion is that I am more optimistic today about improved relations between our two nations.
Where do you think the Russians are in terms of what's possible with